Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. And thank you so much for joining us here this afternoon at the Cornell University with the Einaudi Center for International Studies. I am truly delighted to have this opportunity to engage with all of you on campus and those of you who are joining us virtually through eCornell to attend the Einaudi Center's Lund Critical Debate. I'm Rachel Beatty-Riedel. I'm the director of the Einaudi Center and a faculty member in the Department of Government in the Brooks School of Public Policy. And this year's Lund debate is connected to one of Einaudi's 3 global research priority areas on democratic threats and resilience. Now, we hear about this topic on a daily basis, listening to the news, reading the newspapers, and really across the global arena and in our own backyards. We are constantly thinking about the questions of how democracy is functioning, whether or not it's delivering public services, opportunities for us to be represented, to have our preferences shape government policy, and larger questions over who holds power, how that power is utilized, who has voice, and who can be represented, how our needs are met, and who is considered a member of a particular community, and who can live in freedom and security. These questions about how democracy and democratic practice operate to meet our most basic human needs of expression and of liberty are, I would argue, the most urgent questions of our time, from our local communities to those farthest from where we sit here today. And I'm truly passionate about bringing these questions to light here at Cornell with all of you in conversation, in part because these are the very questions that have always driven my own research in West Africa and Southern Africa, and extend to cross-regional research projects that we engage on through the Einaudi Center and with our colleagues in the Law School, Arts and Sciences, CALS, ILR, and the Brooks School of Public Policy. Cornell's overarching commitment to these themes, to democracy, to rights, to freedom of expression, to education and knowledge, is what drives our mission as a leading university and orients our work with students as well as our partners across the world. So today, the Einaudi Center is truly pleased and honored to host this event on democracy and its opposites, and to engage with our honored guests, as well as our audience of students and faculty and community members here in this room, and those joining us from around the globe. Before turning it over to our Lund debate keynotes, we are first honored to have with us Provost Michael Kotlikoff to provide an official welcome on behalf of the university. Thank you, Provost Kotlikoff.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm between you and the experts, so I'll be brief. On behalf of Cornell and the Einaudi Center for International Studies, welcome to this year's Lund Critical Debate, Democracy and Its Opposites, Challenges in a Global World, and thank everyone for attending. I'm honored to welcome our 2 speakers, Thomas E. Garrett, Secretary General of the Community of Democracies, and Damon Wilson, President and CEO of the National Endowment for Democracy. Thank you, Tom and Damon, for your participation in this debate. I'd also like to thank Judith Lund Biggs, class of '57. Judith, I hope you're attending by Zoom, who established the Lund Critical Debate Series in 2008. She did this to bring together noted experts in international affairs to discuss issues in world news and policy. Judith herself served as a staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I know this is a topic close to her heart. Today's debate speaks to one of the Einaudi Center's global research priorities, democratic threats and resilience. The topic assesses challenges to democratic institutions and practices and values, and identifies the opportunities for democratic strengthening and sustainability. How nations are governed has an enormous impact on how they respond to everything from pandemics and climate change to human rights. We rely on institutions of democracy as the means of expression of the will of the governed. Democratic institutions ensure that the powerful may be held to account. Around the world, and here in the United States, we're seeing threats to those institutions and threats to democracy itself, both from external influences and internal actions. These threats can lead to disenfranchisement, to disparate political outcomes, and to the erosion of checks and balances and of trust in our institutions. The conversation today is an opportunity to examine complex issues surrounding democratic resilience, including political organizations, minority rights, and strategies such as gerrymandering that limit democratic participation. Our speakers will also offer insight into strategies for resilience that citizens and governments can adopt as they combat these challenges locally and globally. Thank you all again for being with us today. Now I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Rachel Beatty Rydell, Director of the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies, the John S. Knight Professor of International Studies, and Professor in the Department of Government and Brooks School of Public Policy. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Provost Kotlikoff, for joining us today and for your support and the university's support for the Freedom of Expression initiative at Cornell, which President Pollock announced last week as part of next year's academic university-wide theme. I think that today's discussion will really highlight our connection to that theme and the ways in which it impacts all of us in our understanding of the need for education in these university spaces. At the Einaudi Center, we really envision a world where people value differences, speak boldly, and welcome exchange. And the Lund Debate itself has brought this spirit alive on campus for 15 years. So we're extremely grateful for this opportunity and the formative experience that it affords our students. Now, I want to take up our themes and launch into our dialogue today within the work of democratic threats and resilience in a way of thinking about the expression of democracy itself. We often take pluralistic democracy as the normative goal, but across a diverse political landscape, people with different ideological orientations, different political orientation, different identities also hold conflicting views of what the opposite of democracy is. What would it be in terms of its conception and its outcomes? That is, there may be factions that would deny the democratic legitimacy of political opponents themselves and manipulate democratic institutions to exclude them or to weaken the extent of becoming unequal players. So these opposites of democracy can take many forms. The opposite of democracy may be authoritarianism. The opposite of democracy may be communism. The opposite of democracy may be an exclusive citizenship that denies members of a political community their ability to fully participate and experience equal rights. It may be an oligarchic control over the full means of the economy and the state. So these different conceptions of democratic fundamentals and its opposites put important actors within a given country sometimes at odds in addressing who participates and what liberties should be protected in order to nourish and preserve democracy, and which competitive guardrails must be maintained or potentially relaxed in order to guarantee democratic outcomes. So that is, which are the formal institutions, such as the courts, the legislature, the bureaucracy of the state, and the laws and norms about democratic practice that must be maintained at all costs, or which can be pushed and pulled in order to protect democracy in practice. So these are some of the fundamental debates that diplomats discuss, that local civil society organizations discuss in their strategies when they're thinking about how to best preserve or enact democracy in their given contexts and settings. So I'd like to launch this Lund debate with this framing in terms of thinking about how we see these opposites playing out in contestations for and against democracy across the world. So to take up these questions and to share their unique expertise and perspectives, we have the pleasure of learning from our two distinguished visitors. And we will turn first to Damon Wilson as the President and CEO of National Endowment for Democracy.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rachel, for that introduction. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be with you here at Cornell tonight as part of this Lund Critical Debate. And as Rachel said, open, respectful debate is essential for democracy. Public discussion of ideas, it supports an informed citizenry, and we see this around the world, that the ability to have critical thinking itself is a building block for democratic culture. So thanks, Rachel, for hosting us, Provost Kotlikoff for having us here, the Einaudi Center, and for all of you for coming out tonight to engage in this conversation about democracy. And I'm delighted to do this with Tom Garrett of the Community of Democracies. And my only fear, as I said to Rachel, was I'm not sure that we'll have enough to debate between ourselves, but we're going to try, and we'll invite you into that. College campuses, I think as you well know, are places filled with energy and possibility. And at the risk of sounding ancient, being here at Cornell brings me back to my own student days. When I was born, there were 29 democracies in the world. By the time I got to college at Duke, the number was up to 77. It was a heady moment. The fall of the Berlin Wall was seen by many as the final inevitable triumph of democracy over communism. We were witnessing the end of military juntas in Latin America, democratic transitions in Africa and Asia, and like many in that era, I was intoxicated with a sense of possibility, of opportunity, and this brave and free new world. It wasn't all good news, of course. There was the Tiananmen Square massacre, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, bloody wars in the Balkans. But the United States was the only remaining superpower and the guarantor of what seemed to be a global democratic order that was emerging. We could not imagine that democracy would ever again be on the defense. We were wrong. In each of the past 17 years, over the past 2 decades, we've seen the number of countries that have moved away from democracy has exceeded the number of countries that have moved towards democracy. Backsliding and populism in established democracies, they're part of the story, no doubt. But there is also no doubt that in recent years, the world's authoritarians, armed with powerful new technologies, have taken their fight against freedom to a dangerous new level. While sharpening their repression at home, they've embarked on a systematic and sophisticated global effort to corrupt and destabilize existing democracies, while actively seeking to prevent democracy from taking hold elsewhere. And their compulsion to undermine free democracies provides confirmation of the power and the allure of democratic ideals. We all know democracy isn't perfect by any means. If you have a sense of American history and our own experience, whether today or in the past. But the sheer numbers of those fighting for freedom or fleeing authoritarian regimes tells us people everywhere instinctively understand that their lives are happier, safer, more prosperous in a free society, something that is backed up by data. And as long as democracy persists, we're seeing that authoritarians never feel entirely secure because they know that despite the rhetoric in which they are appropriating democracy and human rights, they actually don't govern with the intentional consent of their people. And we saw just a couple of weeks ago when Xi Jinping was in Moscow, he was departing, he said to Vladimir Putin, now there are changes that haven't happened in 100 years, and we are together, we are going to drive these changes. I agree, said Vladimir Putin. But the changes that we see taking place incrementally around the world and international institutions, they're meant to make the world safe for autocracy, which by definition can mean a threat to democracy. Beijing is spending billions of dollars on anti-democratic activities because it understands that often corroding democracy and the rest of the world is the best way to protect the Communist Party's monopoly on power. Russia works to crush democratic uprisings beyond its borders to reduce the chances of homegrown challenges. It bolsters corrupt autocrats to gain partners in changing democratic norms at the United Nations and other international bodies. These dictators view democracy not just as a competitive system of governance, but sometimes as an existential threat to their own survival. And yet, I'm still an optimist by nature. At the start of 2022, my first full year as NED's president, there really wasn't much to cheer about. As we saw democracy under duress, autocrats on the defense, it seemed as if momentum was on the wrong side. We saw Xi cementing his authority, jailing opponents, rolling back freedom in Hong Kong, persecuting Tibetans, waging a genocide against Uyghurs. We saw Russian tanks rolling across the border into Ukraine. We saw religious leaders, the theocracy in Tehran, ruling with a heavy fist while the Taliban consolidated control in Afghanistan. Daniel Ortega imprisoned his political opponents in Nicaragua. But you flash forward a year, and at the start of this year, there was a shift in that momentum, and we saw average citizens doing extraordinary things. Ukrainians stopped, and they began to push back Russia's invading forces. Even inside Russia, tens of thousands of Russians summoned the courage to protest the war, knowing that they faced arrest. 20,000 are now in detention, and over 1 million fled the mobilization, the military mobilization. We saw a deadly fire that killed Uyghurs trapped in their apartments because of China's zero-COVID policies, unleashed the largest wave of civic unrest across China in decades, leading Xi to reverse course on the pandemic. And in Iran, the death of Mahsa Amini, resulting from a simple headscarf violation, sparked protests throughout the country among every major ethnic group. Is the pendulum swinging? Are the autocrats being confronted with the consequences of their own decisions, their overreach, the lack of self-correcting mechanisms? Well, they may or may not be nearing their own Berlin Wall moments anytime soon. The process of democracy is not linear. We can't determine that from here. But it is the relentless courage of ordinary people, despite ever harsher repression, reminds them and us that the demand for democracy is strong. And under the right set of circumstances, even the most repressive, seemingly secure regimes can change overnight. And there's no way to predict when a democratic breakthrough might occur. It's not our role to do so. The future of any nation must rest in the hands of its own people. And that's this essence of democracy. So open societies have built-in shock absorbers providing outlets for people's frustrations. While repressive societies, they may seem stable, but they are fundamentally brittle. And there are indeed challenging times for those of us who believe in democracy. The endowment that I had was created 40 years ago with bipartisan congressional backing as an independent foundation dedicated to strengthening democratic institutions and values around the world. We provide $300 million in grants to more than 1,500 civil society and independent media organizations in over 100 countries. And this includes support of 4 core institutes, which draw on the expertise of both major political parties in the United States, as well as business and labor communities. Entities that disagree, fight inside our democracy, but work together to support the concept of democracy around the world. And at the endowment, we don't presume to tell our partners what they should do. We support their democratic aspirations. We stand by them in their nonviolent struggle. And so our approach is built on people, on long-term relationships of trust, and giving individuals an agency to shape their own future. And our structure allows us to respond quickly with them, such as when Afghans were fleeing the Taliban takeover, Iranians suddenly mobilized in protest, or Nicaraguans were expelled from their homeland. And we're using our resources to enable our partners to work together and to learn from each other. Just as much as we've seen the autocrats do so, Democrats must work together in common cause. So I remain optimistic. More democratic states are under threat. Established democracies are challenged themselves. But we see the majority of people in most countries still prefer the dignity that comes with freedom. And we see that people are willing to risk everything in its pursuit. One of my good friends, the pro-democracy activist Vladimir Kara-Murza, remains an incorrigible optimist. Just last week, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison by the Russian government for speaking out against the war in Ukraine. And I saw him just hours in Washington before he was scheduled to fly back to Europe en route to Moscow. And I said to him, Vladimir, what are you doing? You know you're going to be arrested. Why are you going back to Russia? And he replied with a story about Natalia Gorbanovskaya, one of just 7 demonstrators who went to the Red Square in 1968 to protest the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. And she knew she'd be arrested and would go to prison, but she protested anyways because, in her words, it meant the authorities could never claim that everyone in the Soviet Union approved of the invasion. The Czechs took notice. A Prague newspaper wrote, "We now have at least 7 reasons for which we will never be able to hate the Russian people." So as my friend Vladimir put it, even if we accept a dictator's narrative that the majority of the population is on board with them, every voice in opposition is precious. Even 7 people can sometimes save the honor of an entire nation, let alone the thousands that are arrested for protesting Putin's war on Ukraine since it began. Despite everything that's happening today, he told me, I am certain a more hopeful time will come and we will begin the important work of building a democratic Russia, integrating it into the civilized world, and this time we better get it right. So we see around the world, despite the challenges, the struggle for freedom persists. There's an insatiable yearning inside people to push that. And we owe it to the courageous men and women fighting for freedom to back them up, offer support and solidarity, and together redouble our efforts to forge a path forward towards justice, towards liberty. It won't be easy. We're in a tough spot. But I do believe that ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world will write democracy's next chapter. And for many of you, for me, for many of us, that work begins at home, in local communities, in our communities across the nation. And that's the power of a free society. You don't have to ask for permission. You can act. In fact, you better act. And acting together is a crucial self-correcting mechanism for democracies. But it's a muscle you have to use, have to exercise, and deploy. And I do think it will be this generation, your generation, that goes to work to shape a more democratic, just future, stepping up to demand individual liberties, the ability to make your own choices for a more just, peaceful future. And we are counting on you. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to turn to Thomas Garrett, who is the Secretary General of the Community of Democracies. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. And Provost Kotlikov, Director Riedel, esteemed faculty, students of Cornell University, I want to thank you for this opportunity to join you this evening. I've had a very informative and interesting time on your campus today, especially in the visit to the Political Pathways to Equality class I was able to join. Thank you for your input, your questions, and your enthusiasm. Speaking from 3 decades of work supporting democratic transitions and consolidation around the world, I can say that this is the right time, both in the United States and in the world, for us to have a discussion on democracy and its opposites, challenge in a global world. I am here representing the Community of Democracies, which is a coalition of governments committed to the idea that pluralistic democracy will always face new challenge, but also will always face growing opportunities, and that the way to meet both challenge and opportunity is through democratic solidarity. What makes the Community of Democracies, which was founded in the year 2000 by Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, what makes it different as an intergovernmental body is that it was not built on linguistic or geographical or economic criteria, but was built on a commitment to principles of democracy, to the 19 principles of human right, democracy, and the rule of law that are contained within the Warsaw Declaration, which is our governing document. Democratic erosion and authoritarian attempts to reshape the norms of human rights have long been of concern to the member states of the Community of Democracies. For several years now, in so many corners of the world, at so many levels, from the grassroots to the highest elected offices, in so many countries, it seemed that the global challenges today, which hold real consequences for all of our lives, are not being met with adequate solutions, not even by democracies. Especially before the pandemic, there was certainly a trend to highlight democracy's shortcomings and to question its effectiveness following such things as the 2008 financial crisis, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the rise of populist governments around the world. And I can tell you that in this year, 2023, democracy is challenged externally by aggressive authoritarian powers that are bent on global ideological supremacy. I think the authoritarian intent to make this world a place where might makes right is unmistakable when we see the Kremlin invade its struggling yet democratic neighbor, Ukraine, returning the violence of war to Europe's geographic heart for the first time since the Second World War. Hong Kong has lost once promised freedoms, while abroad, China has undertaken a full-fledged assault on human rights and democratic norms within the United Nations, to say nothing of Beijing's dangerous escalation of threat against the democratic people of Taiwan. Besides the external threat, democracy faces internal threats from demagogues that are trampling on constitutional rights in their quest for power. In consolidated and incomplete democracies alike, we see too often elected politicians erode democracy from within, starting with small and sadly often popular steps, which are beyond their constitutional authority and which inevitably will lead to broader strokes against democracy itself. In just the last few weeks in the United States, we've witnessed state legislatures undertake attempts to exclude their fellow Americans from public life, to limit voting participation, and to try to silence any dissenting views. For more than a decade now, I think any Google search or academic review on the subject of democracy will almost always pop up with cleavages in democracy, erosion of democracy, democracy's apparent weakness in multilateral bodies defending human rights. Yet, I also now see much more often the word resilience of democratic institutions, resilience of new voting blocs, appearing more increasingly. And more we hear, I think, very inspiring stories of people, everyday people, taking to the streets to defend the democratic rights of their country. On the international stage, we've seen the unprecedented indictment of Vladimir Putin for his crimes against humanity. We saw, for instance, the removal of Iran from the Commission on the Status of Women. These are showing us that there are signs out there of democratic solidarity and resistance. In short, I can say that I see hopeful signs around the world that democracy is pushing back. The Biden administration's second Summit for Democracy recently took place not only in the United States, but also in Costa Rica, the Netherlands, the Republic of Korea, and in Zambia. I was in Costa Rica for that summit, where the US Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, delivered a very powerful speech to the international gathering, in which she talked about the difficult lessons that have been learned by the United States in its history, ranging all the way back to the Whiskey Rebellion, to the Civil War, to the attack on our Capitol on January 6. The point she was trying to make, I think, was clear to everyone in the room, and that is every democracy has to grapple with those who would undermine the people's will. She also made the point every democracy is going through this struggle. But what I very much appreciated was Ambassador Thomas Greenfield then noted what many observers of democracy are beginning to speak to, the possibility that we've reached a turning point. For the first time in more than a decade, the number of countries with a decline in their democratic ratings was not bigger than the number of democracies that the ratings show have greater freedom. President Biden has said he believes we're at an inflection point on democracy, both in the United States and worldwide, and I would have to say I concur. Supporters of democracy and human rights can be encouraged because democracy is still the main form of governance worldwide. Over the long term, electoral democracies themselves haven't declined in number since the 1970s. There are still more than 120 countries in this category. But the point that must be stressed, this is not the result of chance or the good luck. Instead, democratic gains have been preserved by civil society and democratic governments working together. USAID Administrator Samantha Power, writing in a recent foreign affairs issue, said, "Democracy is not in decline, rather it is under attack." And I believe that we should view it as so and respond accordingly, and we should reframe this discussion, this debate. What this would require is for democratic governments to speak openly with and to one another, which is what the community of democracy seeks to facilitate. This requires democratic governments to maintain an open and continuous dialogue with civil society. And it also requires activists and everyday people like you to renew your commitment to your democracy and to participate. So I would just say that in closing, at this time in history, at this possible inflection point in history, rather than accept democratic erosion as a new normal, which I feel like we did for a very long time, democratic governments and their civil societies need to move to a proactive position to say, yes, there's always going to be complex challenges facing democracy, but there is also a way to work together to try to resolve them. So thank you again. I look forward to hearing from you and speaking with you tonight. Thank you.
Great. Wonderful. So for our Lund debate format, I'm going to take the prerogative of the moderator to pose a few questions to our guests, and then I welcome you. We're going to have floating mics. I'll let you know when it's an opportunity for the audience to pose your questions, so please be formulating them, and we'll also take questions from our online guests, so you can upvote those and make sure you let me know which ones you want to be posed. But I'm going to start out with a question for both of our guests. And it's really, to kind of think about your shared commitment, of course, to democracy, to constitutionalism, to rights and freedom of expression. That's a kind of core shared principle, set of objectives and aims. But you vary in the strategies that your organizations take and the types of actors that you engage with, from diplomatic protocols, international leadership, to really grassroots, fundamental civil society engagement with local partnerships. So these are very different approaches to potentially the same outcomes or thinking about what we would be supporting in terms of democracy around the world. So I was wondering if you could tell us, both from your varied positions, what do you see as the sources of democratic resilience? How does the role of civil society and the electorate, when we think about the people, the masses who may not be organized into civil society organizations but exist as autonomous individuals, how do they interact with the systems and structures in place at the domestic level, and how can they be the actors of democratic resilience? And when we look at the international, and in particular the transnational networks of support for democracy, how do we think about the levers that can be pushed and pulled for democratic support? So Damon, why don't I start with you?
Sure, thanks. Thank you, Rachel. You're right, that Tom and I complement each other in some respects, because the focus of the endowment is on an engaged citizenry. It is engaged civic society organizations as well as independent media organizations. And it's premised on diversity first. So even if you think about how we come together, we brought, in our founding, brought together Democrats, Republicans, business and labor to come together in supporting civic-minded organizations around the world, growing out of the tradition that began in the United States of labor supporting the Solidarity movement in Poland. And so this diversity of support, reflecting groups that argue, fight, disagree with each other on policy issues in the United States, but understood to stand by and support those around the world that are in this struggle. And so the premise is, and for governments, democratic governments to function, or even we often see in non-democratic governments, the ability of an engaged citizenry to hold accountable, to push government to be responsive. These are the muscle movements of exercise of democracy that are required to hold elected leaders or unelected leaders often accountable to their people's demands, and to see the mechanisms through which they can be held to court, whether there is a legislative branch that has to be responsive to demands of citizens and organized groups in society, whether there is recourse for recourse to ensure there is no impunity through rule of law and judicial systems. And so our commitment is to support these local groups, civic actors, independent media, and our approach is to do so in a way that is demand-driven. so that we're proud of the work we do, we're confident in the values, but as Tom was alluding to in Linda's speech in Costa Rica, we're very humble in the approach. It's a demand-driven approach for democracy to be sustainable. It has to be relevant in your society, authentic in your community, responsive to the culture of the environment. And so our commitment is how to be responsive to the demand signals that we see from partners in these countries around the world. What are their ideas? How is it their struggle? How is it their effort? And how do we support that, understanding that it will manifest in very different ways? And so that diversity, that demand-driven part, is part of ensuring that there is an engaged citizenry, an engaged set of actors that can hold governments accountable and help them be responsive to the will of the people.
Thank you. And Tom?
Thank you. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, I think the source of this pushback against attempts to erode democracy comes from civil society, and that's a big word, civil society. Really what I'm talking about here, I'm talking about youth activism. I'm talking about here in the United States, the number of women we see participating in elections, both as candidates, but also turning out in large force ever since 2016. It's the source of resilience are people who, it's very hard to define what is the breaking point. But in so many countries around the world, it seems as people have hit a breaking point. And rather than being alienated and apathetic from a government that doesn't respond to them, they decide to take to the streets and do everything peacefully and legally to push that government to finally listen to them and respond. We're made up of an intergovernmental group. Canada is the presidency at the moment of the Community of Democracies. And when they became president, they stated their theme was to support resiliency. And so it is a word that one hears often now. It covers a lot of things, but I think it just essentially responds to pushing back against the erosion of democratic values. And so the source of that is really the people, the voter.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So I want to take up a question in terms of thinking about this, the potential that we're at an inflection point. As, you know, the potential that democracy could continue to decline in the years ahead, or that we might be at a moment of kind of stagnation, or that democracy could continue to be resilient. And in particular, if we're thinking about the moment that we face in terms of supporting democracies, as you both just described, it seems as though the challenges that democratic actors face today are fundamentally different than they were 20 to 30 years ago, right? Really at the moment that we were discussing the third wave, the fall of the Soviet Union, all of the associated transitions to democracy, often those challenges were about trying to make practical and functional nascent, fragile, new democracies and protect democracies that had transitioned from threats from military actors, for example, right? So often we would hear about the undoing of democracy through a military coup. What we see today is often very different pathways, right? The undoing of democracy through presidential actions, aggrandizement of the executive, using the legislature or the courts, democratic institutions, to limit the space and scale of opposition activities and freedoms of expression, right? So the ways in which democratic decline or backsliding or deconsolidation may be happening has changed in terms of the patterns, the strategies that we see would-be autocrats using. It's also changed in terms of the potential types of countries in which this democratic decline is happening. We may be witnessing democratic decline in more wealthy countries, in more long-standing advanced industrial democracies, and as well in more fragile or vulnerable democracies. So we see such a range of change in terms of the types of democratic threats that we face. So I'm wondering if you can speak to who are the opponents to democracy that you see, that your constituents are interacting with? And how do these opponents to democracy self-define? Are they coming out as anti-democratic in their narrative of some alternative that they wish to propose? Or do they seek to be in opposition to a particular ideology or identity or perception, so that they're positing their authoritarianism perhaps in different narratives? Tom, I'm going to start with you.
And so I think the opposite to democracy in this case that you're referring to, we find authoritarian, semi-authoritarian, growing authoritarian leaders actually almost entirely want to say they are democratic. No one comes out to say, I am against democracy. You may find someone that comes out to say, I'm against American-style democracy, I'm against the Scandinavian liberal democracy. But almost all authoritarian leaders wrap themselves with the cloak of democracy, and they try to say we're presenting a new version of democracy, which they are not. They usually want to portray themselves as patriotic or nationalistic, standing up for the values of the country in which they live. But in reality, it's a polarizing situation. The opposites to democracy are those who wish to exclude certain segments of the population, who want to deny voting access, not voting rights, but voting access, voting capacity to certain groups. And the provost mentioned at the beginning, one of the problems he noted was gerrymandering. And gerrymandering in the United States is sending politicians, elected officials of both parties to Washington, totally elected purely upon the basis of their partisan backers, and they have no reason to ever speak to the people who didn't vote for them. They have no reason to ever speak to the other side, and they behave that way once they get to Washington. And so I would just say, democracy is seeking to include as many people as possible, ensuring that every person in this room that is eligible to vote is able to vote. And the opposite to that is trying to say, this portion of the room, we will limit the number of polling stations in this side of the room, and we will put more of them over in this side of the room. And so, but the interesting thing is it's all being done within, again, a cloak of democracy. China, at the Human Rights Council in Geneva just a few months ago when I was there, gave this hour-long speech about how they were a real democracy, unlike the United States. Everyone wants to be a democracy, to claim that. The People's Democratic Republic of. But I'll just go ahead and stop with that.
Perfect, thank you. David?
It is
Don't know where I was going.
The phenomenon that Tom was talking about is actually partly why I'm pessimistic in the short term. I think we still have peak disruption ahead of us. But I'm optimistic in the long term, because we've passed a threshold in global debate where we don't have different rationales from arguing what is the source of legitimacy. In fact, we've seen autocrats, demagogues, communists seed the concept that legitimacy is based in the will of the people. Mm-hmm. Now, what they're doing is trying to define the systems and how that's achieved, and co-opting democratic norms and human rights to expand that definition in a way that makes it acceptable for very anti-democratic and anti-human rights-based policies. But we've sort of won an existential argument at an intellectual level. Now we are in a knife fight on the tactical ground game on how that applies. And so we do see self-definition really interesting, because the self-definition is not an opposite to, it's co-opting. It's trying to co-opt these things. That's pretty dangerous, actually. But it's also, we see an overlap between whether it's demagogues in somewhat open societies or autocrats in very closed societies. They're still trying to anchor the will of the people, often around traditional values, often defining it in opposition to fear of an element of society, galvanizing against certain communities, fear of external threat and challenges. In part, you hear Vladimir Putin at times, with an ideology of hysteria around the fact that the West is about to attack Russia, because it has become a source of legitimacy that he is defender of the nation. And it doesn't work if there's not a perceived threat. And so I do believe that you, the students here in particular, will be alive and participating in what will ultimately be a fourth democratic wave of democratization in the world. We're in a rut right now. We're not in that fourth wave. President Biden said we might be turning the corner. I hope we're at an inflection point, but I don't think we're quite there yet. Because what we've seen, the reaction since 2008's financial crisis would hit Main Street more than Wall Street. We've seen across established democracies a whole environment of globalization where people understand there's a segment of our communities that have been left behind, and we're seeing a bit of a backlash from that in established democracies, which has made things wobbly at a time when autocrats have now gone on offense, not defense, to assert and protect their own autocratic systems by attacking neighbors, undermining neighbors, or engaging in ways around the world that undermines democracy and trying to neuter the international mechanisms that held them accountable in the past so that a UN Human Rights Council becomes a joke rather than a real fora for debate. And so I'm worried because this environment is sharper repression at home, now with a coordinated campaign among autocrats that export the tools, the tactics to technologies. Belarusian police have been coached by Russian police on how to do crowd control and how to prevent. We see societies using Chinese exported face surveillance technology, AI surveillance technology, and an information environment subject to disinformation, incentivizes polarization, and in a financial environment where many of these autocrats, it's not just about their hold on power, it's about protection of the resources they have stolen from their people and their state. Behind almost every autocrat is an incredible set of bank accounts that are coded and hidden, often in free societies. And until we understand a democracy strategy as one that has to deal with kleptocratic networks and our complicity sometimes in that, they actually have an incredible incentive to back each other up and protect their resources by pretending to be the nationalist defender of themselves. Understanding that we've entered a new age of technology that offers so much possibility, but it also has allowed them to turbocharge their repression. Until we figure out how to get the regulation, the democratic norms behind technologies today and leverage it for democracy, we can see a dark side in which a dictator has to just run any public footage of protests for facial recognition technology to decide who they need to go pick up tomorrow and put in prison. And so we see them self-defined as a new term of democracy, which is quite hypocritical, allows them to cover sort of the underlying kleptocratic financial means behind control. And it means that I think we're still headed for peak disruption until we help anchor more self-correcting mechanisms in established democracies and see the resilience of those in autocratic societies. But what gives me hope over the long term is despite how tough it's gotten, the numbers that have been forced to flee their societies because of this repression, they don't stop. They don't stop. People are driven to fight for their own voice, and that's incredible, and that does give me hope.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I want to take up a point here that you mentioned in terms of the role of technologies, sharing both in terms of global kleptocratic networks, autocratic networks, as well as civil society, kind of pro-democracy sharing and learning strategies. So one of our students, Gabriella Best, submitted a question in advance that I'm going to just draw from here. And she asked, how should democracies protect free speech while simultaneously combating the spread of misinformation? So here, thinking both about the role of technology in contributing to an ecosystem, a potential ecosystem of misinformation, and also how we might leverage that and anchors and self-correcting mechanisms to think about how we can protect free speech across this variety of spaces. So Damon, can I start with you on that one?
Sure. This is it's a really tricky issue. We're having a debate in our country right now about how do you manage disinformation without silencing certain political voices. It's a really challenging issue, but I think it is important to recognize that the debate we have in our country is fundamentally different from a debate you have in a society that's not free. The ability to access independent information, as I started off with, I think is a fundamental building block of democracy. So much so that a plurality of our support, between 30 and 40%, goes to freedom of expression, to independent media, to access to information. Because ultimately the thought is that if people have access to independent information, they can begin to develop critical thinking, they begin to make decisions on their own. And so when you see in the most repressive societies, when it's North Korea or Tibet, places like that, sometimes the most significant thing is simply access to information. It becomes really complex in open societies, given the nature of our debate and how we regulate these things. And so understanding both when a system, a media system, the ecosystem is a manipulated media environment. And we've seen this progressively in time. If you take, for example, across an African landscape, 50% of smartphones in Africa are sold by Chinese companies that come preloaded with news apps. And those news apps, Opera News and others, as you can imagine, only provide information that would be favorable to the coverage of Beijing. You're not going to learn about what's happening to a Uyghur population or debates at the UN that may be uncomfortable. And we see this when you start to look back and understand the largest news, the sort of Reuters of Africa, has now been purchased by China. You see 60% of the largest newspapers with Chinese ownership in Zambia. You see the only printing presses that are produced in Kenya being purchased by China. In a way that we don't understand what's happening to the ecosystem around us. And so this is a tough enough issue in a benign environment, in an environment where there are not folks trying to disrupt that. But it becomes even more complicated in a weaponized environment. And so I think this is one of the true challenges of our time, because we have seen disinformation used in a way that plays cleavages in our own society, feed the natural bumps, the natural divisions in an open society, pour fuel on that fire, provoke discussions and debate and divisions from within free societies. And so how do you strike the right balance of that open? So they're not easy answers. Part of what we do is we try to make sure that at the international ITU and other UN bodies, the debates in Geneva, that we don't just have governments sitting around the table, that we want to help support groups, civic actors, global actors working together to be at that table and to help shape those norms and standards across the world, and to ensure that as we fumble through this and try to get through this, that we're bringing in diverse actors to shape those standards and not just leaving it to governments alone to set the tone.
Thank you. Tom.
And so this is an issue that the member states of the community of democracies has been concerned about for some time. And it's interesting to see the various approaches in Finland. One of the things they are doing is they have sought to tackle the issue of disinformation. It is the right of a Finnish citizen to post anonymously. And that is their number one protection. A Finnish citizen who wants to say something anonymously has that right. It's a smaller society. People know one another, and to be able to really speak their minds, sometimes they need to be anonymous. And so that's interesting, because that's one of the things I think in other countries it is, no anonymous posting. Canada, it's very interesting. Canada has stated officially it is not the role of the government to be the arbiter of what's right and what's wrong. And it is the right of a Canadian to believe something dumb or not accurate. And that is the right of a Canadian to do if they so want. So what I see is that across all of these various intents to protect free speech and to limit the control of government, several of our member states have moved towards critical thinking for especially younger people. And it is a curricula in their schools in which they teach young people to look at something and to assess it and to say, what would be the impact of this on my community? Who would want to say this, and why would they want to say this? It's again not meant to stop the free flow of information, but it is meant to just teach people to ask those questions. And I think that's probably what we're going to have to move to, is trying to, we don't really want a government deciding what is accurate and what is not accurate during climate change issues or during the pandemic. But we do want to have this critical thinking, I think, something shaped a little bit more appropriately within our our population.
I think that really speaks to the role of the university and educational institutions in fostering that critical thinking. So, very important part of the forming of citizens, of active citizens who can participate in informed ways and to be able to decipher what sources of information and how they take those in as pieces of information that they may build on. So I want to ask one more question of our guests before we open it up to our audience, and that is to think about how democracy connects to other global challenges that we face, to public health, to socioeconomic well-being, the ability of citizens to live freely in safety and security, to climate justice, and the future of the planet, right? So often we might hear a particular narrative of, the messiness of democracy creates gridlock and an inability to get things done, to take on these other challenges. And so I'm wondering how you can weigh in on the ability of democracy to potentially take on these other challenges or not. Tom, I'm going to start with you.
And so I think that as we look at complex issues such as climate disruption, or we look at issues of nuclear non-proliferation, I do believe that democracies are the best suited to try to speak to these issues over time. And it's over time because democracies contain within themselves a self-correcting mechanism called the next election, or the referendum, or recall, for that matter, in certain municipalities and states. And so I think democracies are going to be best suited to try to solve the big issues. They will take in the broadest amount of input of their citizens. They will, again, be a multi-generational process. And so I think it's the system that would enable just the most flexibility and the trial and error. We were speaking again earlier today with one, I think it was in the classroom we visited, about how Russia actually just a few days before Russia invaded Ukraine, Secretary Albright, in one of her last printed editorials, said if Russia takes this step, it will isolate itself from the world. It will be a terrible mistake. It will get mired in a war. All the things she said were absolutely right. But since the beginning of the war with Ukraine, Russia has not appeared to learn a single lesson. They're continuing to do the exact same things they've been doing for over a year, while the Ukrainians have been holding them off. In a democratic system, a parliament would be challenging this. In a democratic system, the media would be raising questions. Why are we throwing men into a meat grinder at the front against the Ukrainians? So this is why I think on these global challenges, the only answer is going to be democracies.
Damon.
It's research from universities show, if you look across indices and aggregate these indices, we've been involved in a research project that has done this, it underscores that people are happier, healthier, wealthier, and more secure living in democracies. But the truth is that's not automatic. I mean, it takes effort, it takes work. It's on average. But to understand democracy as being a form that's responsive to the largest number of people, and that gridlock, that messiness, is actually the essence of building compromise, building consensus, building support for public policy strategies, other strategies to address problems. And so the push and pull that we have ferociously in our country around these issues is the kind of exchange that helps sort of land where's the center of gravity in that democratic debate to tackle this issue. So what's hard is to get it right. It's messy, it's not linear. It's certainly, you can have a more decisive outcome in an autocratic regime where a decision can depend on one person or one core party. It's more difficult, but it is more sustainable, more representative of these issues. And that's why I think the work of the Community of Democracies do, how can democracies work together in common cause on some of these systemic challenges around the world, understanding that yes, you need UN4 where you can have discussions that bring in all countries around the world for global issues, and yet you still have the opportunity to coordinate as democracies on problem solving in a way that you can help set and drive that agenda. And so it doesn't deliver that necessarily, but I think it provides the best pathway to get there.
It reminds me of some of my favorite work grounded in Amartya Sen's research on the ways in which democracy allows us to avoid the worst end of human catastrophe, right? That can be politically induced. The ability to avoid famine, the ability to avoid genocide, right? Because you have those self-correcting mechanisms from within. And I think that's so core to the long term and the messiness of contestation to allow for opposing viewpoints and ultimately to settle on a corrective path as is continually necessary to evolve. So now I want to open it up to our audience. If you can raise your hand, we will have floating mics brought to you. And those who are online, you can use the QR code to pose questions as well. I have them here, and I will take questions from our online audience as well. Okay, we're going to start in the back here with a mic right in the back row. If we can go. Yes, thank you so much.
From what little I've seen of democracy so far, since I have only been here 22 years, when people lose, they tend to start to lose faith in the democratic system, and they start to demand from their representatives that they win at all costs. How do you restore faith for those people?
And could you just introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm Ryan Tremblay. I'm a senior majoring in CS and history.
Great, thank you so much. Who would like to begin? Go for it.
And Ryan, I think that's a fantastic question, because that is a huge danger in understanding. As we said, democracy is a way to contest nonviolently differences and understanding the cyclical nature of that. And when there's a sense that you have to win at all costs, it doesn't mean that you count on the goodwill of politicians or political leaders. That would be relatively naive. It means that there does need to be both a set of checks and balances and institutions that provide protections, guardrails, but also it is the democratic culture part of it, and understanding that it isn't winning at all costs, that this is a lost election, you pick up and you've got another round to go. And I think that attitude is one that is really corrosive for the healthy functioning of democracies. And you're right, I didn't feel that as much when I was your age at Duke, in a way that you feel that in contested communities across the United States right now. And it's partly exacerbated by an information environment, how we have social media, that greater awareness, and how to think about using those things. And that's where there's incredible research taking place at universities on social media impact, the information environments, how to do this in a way that doesn't just lead to that polarization, win at all costs, being only with your like-minded community. And I think that is a new phenomenon that is really challenging us. So it's both the institutional checks and balances, but nurturing that democratic culture, something that hopefully can be invested through practice, experience, and at our education or university systems.
Thank you. Tom.
When I was working in Ukraine in the 1990s, it was a real challenge, because if people lost an election, if some candidate for the first time lost an election, the next one wasn't for about 5 years. And it was not the same as it is here in the United States, where you might seek a congressional seat, lose it, and then run the next year for mayor of your town. And it also was not the kind of system where one started as a young person, perhaps, running for the city council, and then running for mayor or state representative. And so I think our system used to be something we could show as a very good way of keeping people engaged in the political system. But I also remember in the old days that once you won, the campaigning stopped, and you served in the office for 2 years, and then you started again with the campaign. Now, of course, we have this continuous campaign cycle. And I think that has been a real negative impact on this issue of polarization in the United States.
Great. So I'm going to take one question here in the front row. Yes, go ahead. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I'll try to get some debate going in the critical Lund debate. Mr. Garrett, before we turn it over to questions, you sort of talked about how Russia's autocratic system had allowed it to be involved in this war for a long time, despite having really negative results, despite taking heavy casualties. The United States in 2003 engaged in a similarly sort of illegal, unjust invasion of a country, which for the first year was largely cheerled by our free media. It was endorsed by our democratic legislature, and it took 8 years for the United States to officially withdraw troops from Iraq. U.S. servicemen and women still die in Iraq on almost a yearly basis. So I guess, I guess using that as a case example of a democracy, having similar problems, correcting a mistake and a conflict it got involved with. I guess, what would you say to that?
Thank you.
And so what I would say to that is you can certainly see that the United States went to war. At that time, as you mentioned, Russia has gone to war. I think a lot of some similarities start to stop at that point. I think looking at the international coalition, some of the aspects of international law that were involved in the war with Iraq, which I think has obviously turned out to have been a bad idea, are very different from the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Damon may be able to speak to this from his background on National Security Council a bit better than I, but I believe there is a difference. Russia is seeking to change territorial boundaries by violence and by force. And that is not allowed within the United Nations Charter. That is, almost any agreement that Russia has entered into does not provide for that. And so they are in clear violation of international law, which we've seen by the United Nations General Assembly speaking to that, and the majority of nations in the General Assembly condemning this as a hostile act of unjustified, unprovoked assault on another country.
I think the fact that we have this discussion sort of is an important point. If you ask this question in Moscow right now, you're going to jail. That there's a difference of having this discussion in a free society, because you're right that we can have a huge debate on Iraq, and we did. There was a huge debate in society, a democratic vote in Congress, multiple UN Security Council resolutions, and an extensive international and U.S. debate. You can still disagree with the decision and really have harsh judgment on its outcome. And then you look at something like Abu Ghraib, the American troops' abuse of Iraqi soldiers. Who held them accountable? Americans, the United States. We have self-flagellated through this. What happened with weapons of mass destruction, intelligence failure? We have self-flagellated our society to learn what happened. How did we fall into this? How did we get this wrong? So it doesn't mean democracies get it right. It means that we have a right, you have a right to hold your elected officials accountable. And that is quite a bit different from how this war, Russia's war against Ukraine, obviously would be waged. And there's definite issues, obviously, associated with the Iraq decision. And bring it on as a massive debate in a free society. And that's not possible in a place where we are seeing war crimes on a daily basis, the scale of civilian destruction, and the lack of a debate, in which leads to everybody arrested in prison and 1 million people fleeing the country to avoid this issue. And every independent media outlet in Russia, which we've had the privilege of supporting many of them over the years, have now been chased out and have to operate from exile. And so I think the importance is understanding democracies don't nail it. They don't get it right. It's not the right outcomes on everything. As people make mistakes, we will continue to make mistakes. But how do we actually have an open debate, figure that out, hold ourselves accountable, look at the justice behind these issues, hold to account, learn, correct mistakes for there's no impunity. And I think these are fundamental mechanisms that don't mean it's always a good place for everybody's judgment, but give us a way as a society to grapple with failures.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great, okay. We're going to take one question in the back here, the last row on the right. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Smriti I'm MPA candidate at Brooks School. So my question is a bit long, but I'll keep it. Talking about internal threats or challenges to democracy, and especially in context of developing country like India, which still has a society that doesn't completely espouse modern values. It becomes easier for populist leaders to subvert democratic ideals, especially through claims of subjective diplomacy. And with an economy which is able to provide material doles to people, which is perceived as material prosperity, because it is easier to suppress dissenting voice and deliver goodies, while it is difficult to build consensus and then deliver to the public. So now the challenge is more of winning the game of narrative and ideological supremacy, which is in itself kills the self-correcting measures of democracy that we have been talking about. And in a traditional society like India, the dominant ideology still remains the ideology of historical dominant religion, caste, or gender. So how do you reflect on this scenario? And you're talking about students among us, and I know that many people among us and in our cohort still espouses that populist ideology. So how do you reflect on it?
Thank you so much. And really thinking about India as an important case of the rise of a populist leader, right? A broader phenomenon, set of patterns in terms of the rise of populist leaders around the world, premising their legitimacy and their right to rule based on the provision of material goods or a particular majoritarian or minoritarian identity group and the suppression of dissenting voices. So how might you address these phenomenon? Tom.
I had used earlier today in one of the discussions that we had a quote from an American statesman that said, democracy is not where the world is going, it's where the world was. And that is not a current quote, that was back from a few decades ago, and it was by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who went on to become a senator from this state. But he was speaking at that time as the ambassador of the United States to India, and he was concerned about Indira Gandhi's crackdown on civil liberties and the massive arrest of tens of thousands of opposition figures. And it was interesting because it appeared nothing could stop that crackdown. And people were bemoaning this terrible direction of the world's largest democracy at the time, of India. But what was interesting was civil society did what I've talked about it doing in many other places. It organized, it came together, it pushed back, and it said no. And what happened as a result of that restoration of rights in India actually led to Samuel Huntington's third wave that we've referred to tonight. India didn't go out and tell people about it, but people around the world saw this and it inspired others around the world, and it led to this great wave of democratization that took place and brought about these 120 democracies that we still see today. So I would just say that, again, this is, India is a member of the Community of Democracies Governing Council, and they present a number of really interesting lessons learned. They also are very often challenged within our councils as other nations speak to them about issues concerning media freedoms and repression of the opposition. It is a place worth great investment. It's a place worth great engagement for geopolitical reasons, but for democracy reasons. And so it is it's a work in progress as we now realize every country is. And so, yeah.
Thank you.
You know, I'll just add briefly, you may know better than I, but I'm just back from India a couple of weeks ago, and no doubt there is a climate among many journalists that feel a bit of self-censorship now in terms of how they cover issues, immense pressure on opposition, whether what we saw happened with Rahul Gandhi being expelled from parliament, or even pressure on another opposition party that's doing very well at running Delhi right now. And yet, when you really understand the phenomenon that's taking place, you see a Prime Minister Modi who has really differentiated himself between much of India's political elite by not being elite, by paying respect to lower castes, to speaking to Dalits, to signaling in a way that you are part of this effort, while marrying that with a very focused governance approach in which hundreds of millions of Indians now, very poor Indians, get social welfare benefits immediately deposited through electronic means on their phone and their accounts with no intermediary to take money away. If you're poor in India, this is a lot better life. And you're seeing that responding with his popular support. So it's not as if there isn't a reason for why there has been enthusiasm in India behind his rule. We've also seen when the United States shows up and tries to tell people what to do, that's not going to go down so well. Try that in India. See how that goes. Think about how Indians showing up in the US Congress telling us about it doesn't work well that way. And so it's tricky. How do we figure out how to support people in their own effort and their own struggles so that Indians will help trigger their self-correcting mechanisms, recognizing the diversity, the competitive nature, the decentralized nature of the federal system, and one of the most world-class independent electoral commissions that does the most effective job at running elections than compared to any election commission around the world, and how to give oxygen and support those factors that are indigenous to India to help India figure that out in a way that we don't tell what the answer is, but we also don't stand by and be ambivalent about it. But you probably know better than us. It's a complicated situation indeed.
So I'm going to take 3 or 4 questions together as our kind of final concluding set of questions. So we're going to gather them up and give you the last words to respond. And so we're going to start over here. Sorry, wait for the microphone. It's going to go right back. Yes, great. And then we'll come to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for you sharing today. And I want to show some respect to the gentleman earlier who asked the question around the war in 2003. And I have a kind of similar question built on that. Is like, how do you think about the situation when the interest of the United States conflict with democracy, which I can give more examples beyond that war in Iraq war. And also, earlier you talked about the possibility of opponents of democracy. Maybe on that list, the hegemony that Americans try to build along the way can also be on that list. So I just want to hear your opinion on that.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to gather also, if you can bring the microphone here in the front row. Yes, thank you. And then, yeah, great, thank you.
Of course, thank you very much. My name is Pierce DeCane. I also want to just thank Mr. Wilson, Mr. Garrett, and Ms. Beatty Riedel for coming here and taking time out of your day to speak to us. My question relates to the fact that the United States has worked very hard to build an international coalition in the international community in solidarity with Ukraine. However, since the election of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in Brazil, Brazil has become a major pro-Russia voice in the international community. Now, governmental and non-governmental organizations such as the National Endowment for Democracy worked very hard for the Lula campaign, and considering that Lula won with a very narrow victory, arguably were the reason why Lula is now president of Brazil. Considering that Lula has a very, very long history of Russophile, pro-Russia, pro-Putin, anti-American, anti-Western statements, why is it that the United States supported the election of Lula in Brazil in a move that was clearly counterproductive for America's other geopolitical goals? Thank you very much.
Great. And we'll take one more question. Yes, right in the middle. Yes, thank you. I'm going to load you up with a whole bunch of questions.
Thank you so much. My question, I guess, is going back to, I think, Mr. Wilson's point on the threat to democracy. I was going to ask if you think it's possible that there is a sort of bias behind this view or a sort of selective portrayal in this discussion from the point of view of the United States. For an example being, if you say, examples that you had mentioned were like China and Russia, if you start saying, I feel like there's a lot of conversation in terms of these two countries, but we don't have as much conversation in terms of countries like Saudi Arabia, where they're one of the top 5 most non-democratic places in the world. But we're not having these same conversations as we will with China. Could that be because Saudi Arabia is very beneficial to the US economy? They have a lot of oil exports that come to the US. Without them, the US would be in a lot worse state in terms of just countrywide goals. So do you think it's possible that because of how not only anti-democracy but anti-US that Russia and China are, that we're focusing a lot more on them in this discussion than we are other countries that are also as, if not more so, anti-democracy?
It's a great question, and I'm just going to add on to that a little bit with building on some of the questions that have been submitted online. It's very much in line with your question, and it's really about kind of the concerns about the flawed democracy that the United States is. Every democracy in the world is a flawed democracy, a work in progress, a site of contestation. And so do those concerns about America's own flawed practice of democracy and potentially historically and contemporarily neo-colonial policies abroad and U.S. economic policy as contributing to rising inequality and the way, in a way that can sacrifice democratic equality and values in certain cases. So how do we think about supporting democracy globally, being supportive of democratic resilience around the world with these own imperfections and flaws domestically? So Tom, I'm going to turn it to you first.
Okay, well, perhaps I'll sort of start there to note to you that the community of democracies is made up of countries from all around the world. It is not a U.S. organization. Canada is currently president. Republic of Korea sits on the executive committee with Morocco, Romania, Poland, and the United States. And so it should be stressed that when I'm talking about these democratic states working together, we're not talking about the United States and Washington only. We're talking about countries from all around the world, from the global south, from Asia, Africa, Latin America. And so they have found there is, and these countries have actually found a reason to speak to dangers from Russia and from China, because those are the two countries that are actually the most active on the international stage, seeking to change the norms and the guideposts, the rails of human rights. You know, Saudi Arabia actually perpetrates terrible things on its own citizens internally. It's not out there trying to change the laws of this world and trying to change treaties and agreements. Russia and China are well-deserved to be points of discussion by anyone who believes in democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. So that would be my response to that. Let me see, as concerning Brazil, and I'm sure actually this is a point for the National Endowment for Democracy to speak to. The people of Brazil selected the president of Brazil. The former president attempted to deny that, but it was the people of Brazil that decided that. It was not a US position to say you should have Lula or you should have Bolsonaro. So it's very interesting within the community of democracies. Not all of our democracies support the war in Ukraine. Support the effort to speak against Russia. And some of them do look at colonial past and say, you know, we don't believe this is anything but a European war for Europeans to deal with. It's not our problem. And I think they're wrong, because there's a deeper issue here besides geography. It's might makes right. And that is the world Russia and China would like to lead us into, that might makes right, as opposed to there are agreements and treaties that we've all entered into that we will live by, as we've done for the last 75 years. Let me see. I lived and worked for several years in Indonesia, and one of the things that in Indonesia that very often groups like this, students in particular, would say to me is, your country turned a blind eye and even actually encouraged President Sukarno's murder of hundreds of thousands of our people because they were perceived as communist. And what do you think about that? And what I would say to them is, that was 1965, and we're not the same country that we were then. We actually, as a result of that terrible moment, we actually have legislation now. We have a Congress that speaks up against presidents allowing such things to happen. So when we look at Iraq, when we look at these cases, democracy is, I think, self-correcting. We're not the same country we were. I don't know that we would go back into Iraq. I don't think we would support this mass murder of the Indonesians by their own government. And so that is one of the things that makes us different, is we do have a Congress that plays a watchdog role. We do have a media that reports on this honestly. We do have civil society that says this is not what we want as Americans. And so I think I may have covered all three, and I maybe missed something, but I will hope to speak to you after this if I didn't quite get to your point.
These are great questions and tough questions that are important to talk about. And you asked about the conflict between interests and conflicting with democracy. First of all, I'm a believer that there is an alignment between values of support for democratic universal values and a sense of national security, that the support for democracy, the advance of democracy, creates a more peaceful, secure, prosperous world where you don't have as much genocide, famine, peace, or conflict among societies. So I think there's a correlation. But that said, one of the things I love about my job is that we're not the US government. We're intentionally set up to be an independent foundation. I have bipartisan Democrats, Republicans on my board, but we're set up as an independent foundation so that we can be singularly focused on support for democracy and freedom. And so oftentimes I'll see the US government will want to have a constructive relationship with Vietnam, with Philippines, with Egypt, even with Mexico. And the endowment, my organization, isn't about governments. We don't have to follow the line of the US government or other governments. What we're doing is working with the organizations in Vietnam and the Philippines and Egypt and Mexico that believe and are fighting their view, their struggle for how to have accountability, responsive governance, and opportunities. And we're in solidarity as an expression of the American people, in solidarity with the people. And so we sort of don't play the government game, whether it's US government or other governments. And so I hear you on that. We also don't pick and choose and take sides. So the endowment or IRI or NDI would never be in a position to pick a candidate to back Lula, to back certain campaigns. When we support IRI and NDI, they will do political party training and development open to all candidates, open to all parties, working on parliamentary development. But we don't get involved in promoting certain candidates in competitive systems. And so I think, what we see in Brazil, you're absolutely right. President Lula is skeptical of the war in Ukraine, is trying to carve his own path. This is something that is, US foreign policy will have to deal with, Brazilians will have to deal with, but we don't see ourselves as picking or supporting any particular campaign in any country. I agree with Tom's point on Russia and China. The lack of democracy in Saudi is extraordinary. It's one of the most repressive regimes for its own people. It doesn't have as sophisticated or an intentional of an export mechanism. It will often do so against its own citizens, Saudi students studying in the United States under pressure. We actually see from the UAE a more aggressive foreign policy of intervening in the Horn of Africa, in North Africa, sometimes in an anti-democratic form to back up strongmen in certain societies. We see a more active foreign policy. Where we really see a global reach is Russia and China, both to play that fully in international organizations on a global capability. And finally, the United States has a lot of flaws. If you know anything about our history, you understand the challenge of American democracy in a country that started with a constitution that considered African Americans 3/5 of a human being. If you've followed anything of our history, you've seen the injustice that's been right long aside the sense of destiny towards liberty and democracy throughout our history. You study it, you analyze it, you discuss issues of inequality because we're in a free society, because we can push ourselves. And the challenge is we have to convince people. We have to bring along my cousins. We have to bring along your neighbors. We have to bring along your grandparents. That's part of what we've got to do to think about how we get these things right. And it's easy to see the failures. And I said earlier to a group, I'm a gay man from South Carolina who has a member of Congress who is black. That's like incredible evolution in the communities where I've grown up. And if I think historically speaking, the people in my communities in Charleston are more free now than they've ever been. So are things great? Oh my God, no. But don't pretend like they used to be great. It's a process, and that's why we can't take it for granted to have skepticism, to have those that won't accept, those that push, those that are relentlessly unsatisfied. That's how we get stronger. That's how we correct our problems, because we push. But if we self-flagellate so much that we say, we can't dare support democracy overseas because we got so many problems at homes. We can't impose democracy overseas. What it means is that for those who believe that they should have justice, that they should be able to speak freely, that they should be able to organize in unions, that means you abandon them and you say you're on your own. Leave them to their own. And so for me, I see it as a choice of, do we help support, modestly support as we can, those who are struggling in their own societies for that, as a sense of solidarity of how we're in it together and back each other up. And I think that's getting it right. It's tough. Finding the right means to do it is tough. And ensuring that you do it with humility is the starting point, recognizing we're in it together. And through that analysis, that pushing, that probing, we actually solve problems and get stronger.
Absolutely. I just want to conclude by highlighting that last point in terms of thinking about the way in which democracy itself is about challenge. Democratic practice is about contestation, the ability to have contestation within a system of bounded rules and practices that keeps us united and in solidarity, both with our kind of fellow citizens as well as our co-democrats around the world. And so I think that's such an integral part, whether you're operating at the diplomatic level with leaders from around the world, whether at civil society level, with grassroots leaders. And so to think about engagement as the path towards making democratic value and claiming democratic possibility. And so we so welcome and thank you for your engagement tonight by being here with us and engaging in this discussion. And I'd like to thank as well our Einaudi Center staff team, particularly Rick Lee and Linnea Santi for their amazing work in helping us to bring this together, and to thank our distinguished speakers. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And we invite you to join us just in the lobby area for a reception where we can continue this conversation. Thank you.